send your children to the other side of the world when they're 19 and they get on a tour bus, beware. You never know what's going to happen. So one of our first conversations, we were talking about why he was on the other side of the world, and he said he had just done a mission trip in Fiji. And I said, oh, that's really cool. What church do you go to? And he said, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. And I said, what is that? Again, I'd never heard that phrase before, never met an Adventist. And he said, well, we go to church on Saturday. And I said, why? That doesn't make sense. So he very patiently started to educate me into the reasons, into aspects about Adventism. And so we got back from Australia a couple months later and started dating in earnest. And he continued my education into the Adventist world and introduced me to Adventist culture. So I'm assuming you guys might agree with me, but more so than any other denomination I know, there is distinct cultural elements to Adventism. Would you guys agree with that? Right. So, I was hearing phrases like Happy Sabbath, which I thought was kind of strange. He brought me to camp meeting, which felt like an alternate universe to me at that point. And when we went to his parents' house, we had Haystacks. So Haystacks are Kevin's favorite meal. He ate them every single Friday night growing up. And I have to admit, I was not a fan of Haystacks for a really long time. It took me a long time to come around to them. I like them now, but I was not a fan. And so I'm sure the first time he said we were having Haystacks for dinner, I probably gave him a very inquisitive look, possibly even a blank stare. Like, what do you mean we're having Haystacks? I know this look really well because I'm on the receiving end of it every time we introduce any of my non-Adventist family or friends to Haystacks. So, basically the look kind of goes like, what do you mean we're having Haystacks? You mean we're having tacos? We're having taco salad? Burritos? What, for crying out loud, are Haystacks? So in trying to find, an adequate way to describe the meal and the process, because we all know it's a process as well, rather than just repeating the word haystack over and over again, because that doesn't actually give anybody any clarity, I have spent some time pondering haystacks. What makes a haystack a haystack? This could be a really deep philosophical question for the week. Maybe you'll take more out of the sermon than this, but if not, maybe you can just better understand your lunch today. So how is a haystack then different from a taco salad or from a burrito? And I think the crux of the difference is the foundation. So when you have a taco, your foundation is generally a tortilla or some kind of hard taco shell. When you have a taco salad, your foundation is going to be lettuce. Maybe if you're really hip, it's kale or some other kind of greens, but that's your foundation. But when you have a haystack, generally your foundation is going to be chips, and then beans, and then all the other toppings above. All the same ingredients are going to be present in, say, a taco salad, but the order and the ratios are different, right? And the other interesting thing is that pretty much every Adventist has their own take on haystacks. So my family, but not me, I'm going to make this incredibly clear, definitely not me, likes pickles on haystacks. Right, yeah. The Roberts love cucumbers. I'm with the Roberts. I think pickles are a waste of a good cucumber, so I'm all for the cucumber aspect. The McKees like cottage cheese on their haystacks. Other people like ketchup. Everyone has their own kind of take on it, but it's still a haystack because of its foundation. So you may be wondering where I'm going with this, but this gets me thinking about the foundations of our spiritual lives. So as a body of believers, we might, what we call ourselves is going to strongly depend on what our foundation is. We might say that we're Adventist, but if our title doesn't go any deeper than our culture, our title doesn't have a lot of meaning. We might say that we're Christians, but if our lives are not reflecting biblical truth, then our terminology isn't correct either. But if we're saying that we're followers, or if you've heard me preach before, I like to use the phrase apprentices of Jesus, then the very foundation of our lives should be built around him. So what I want to do today is spend some time kind of getting back to basics, peeling away all the layers or the toppings that we add on top of that foundation, and really focus on what it means to be an apprentice of Jesus. What is that foundation? So Jesus says in Luke chapter 6, verses 46 through 49, and I'm going to be reading mostly from the NLT today with a little bit of NIV mixed in for fun. So Jesus says in this parable, "So why do you keep calling me Lord, Lord, when you don't do what I say? I'll show you what it's like when someone comes to me, listens to my teaching, and then follows it. It's like a person building a house who digs deep and lays the foundation on solid rock. When the floodwaters rise and break against that house, it stands firm because it's well built. But anyone who hears and doesn't obey is like a person who builds a house right on the ground without a foundation. When the floods sweep down and against that house, it'll collapse into a heap of ruins." So what stands out to me about this parable is the preamble, where Jesus is questioning why someone is going to come to him, listen to him, but not follow through on what he's teaching. It's like someone that says that they're having haystacks, but all they're actually having is a plate of lettuce. There's no substance there. And it's important to note that both builders here are calling Jesus Lord. It's like both people are coming and sitting in the pews at church, but only one is allowing the teachings of Jesus to actually change their lives. So the extent to which we model our lives around Jesus' words is going to determine the strength of our foundation and then how we react to how everything life throws at us. So Paul expands on his foundation theme in his letter to the Corinthians. So in 1 Corinthians 3, 10 through 15, he says, "Because of God's grace to me, I have laid the foundation like an expert builder. Now others are building on it. But whoever is building on this foundation must be very careful. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one we already have, Jesus Christ. Anyone who builds on that foundation may use a variety of materials, gold, silver, jewels, wood, hay, or straw. But on the judgment day, fire will reveal what kind of work each builder has done. The fire will show if a person's work has any value. If the work survives, that builder will receive a reward. But if the work is burned up, the builder will suffer great loss. The builder will be saved, but like someone barely escaping through a wall of flames." This can be your feel-good verse for the day. So Paul is saying here, what matters most is our foundation, which is our solid belief in Jesus Christ and his sacrifice for us. What we pile on top of that foundation, things like church culture, things like our habits, our preferences, like all the toppings of a haystack, it may or may not actually be beneficial. So why am I talking to you about this today? So in looking around our current state of the world, I feel like so many people get caught up in the details of everything that's happening, where it's easy to lose sight of our foundation. We focus on the materials of the exterior, but not the core. We focus on the pickles, but not the beans, to keep our haystack analogy going. So I think it's worthwhile to be reminded of the basics of our foundation. So if we're to be calling ourselves Christians, that means we are Christ's ambassadors to the world. Would you agree with that? Good. So that's so. In order to accurately represent him, we need to be living by what he taught us. And those teachings should be evident in our actions and interactions with everybody we encounter. So then what are the basics? What does it mean to have a foundation in Jesus? So every once in a while, I think we need to be reminded that in the grand scheme of things, so much of what we get caught up in, things that we get angry about, things that we allow to steal our time and our emotional energy, are just details that keep us from remembering the bigger picture. So it's like those frame pieces of art that were really popular about 20 years ago. They're called stereograms. I have an example of one if you want to put it up on the screen. Should be the next slide. Okay, so they're all these little pixels, and apparently there's an image hiding behind it, if you focus your eyes in a weird way. Can anyone see the image behind it? Okay, good. Oh, good, Jesse can. Wow, nice. What's behind it? I can never see these. I hate these things, by the way. Gave me anxiety just trying to find an example of them. Doesn't matter how cross-eyed I make myself, what close, far up, I have never once been able to see the image underneath. What's hiding behind this picture, Jesse? Good. I think it was supposed to be Jesus. That's what the caption said, but it could have been anything because I can't see them. Doesn't matter what I do. So anyway, I think that my brain just doesn't work that way, where I can't see past the little pixels on the outside to see what's beyond it. And I think that's sometimes what's happening in our lives, particularly in this moment of history, where we get so caught up in all the little details that we can't think of the bigger picture that's behind it. So let's bring that picture into focus. Each of the Gospels quote Jesus saying what the two most important commandments are, which are love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, from Deuteronomy 6:5, like Winston read, and love your neighbor as yourself, which is from Leviticus, like Wyatt read. And so I'm confident again that these verses are not newsflashes to anybody in this room. We all know these verses. It's pretty simple stuff. It's like Christianity 101. And honestly, I had a hard time preparing for this sermon, kind of worrying that it was going to just seem too simple. But then I realized that me worrying about it was exactly the point that I'm trying to make. Sometimes it's easy to want to focus on the things that we view are sophisticated or new or edgy or challenging, and then to lose sight of what the basics are, what that foundation is. And then the Spirit convicted me then, if I can't preach about love, what is the point of me preaching at all? Because love is the most important thing. It's like what Pastor Ofer said a few weeks ago, what's love got to do with it? And the answer, of course, is everything. So I like how the Gospel of Mark tells this story. So we've got a teacher of the law who comes and asks Jesus what the most important commandments are. And he responds, like I said, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And this lawyer really resonates with his answer. He says, well said, teacher. The man replied, you are right in saying that God is one and that there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings or sacrifices. And so this statement reminds me of when Jesus quotes Hosea, saying that what he desires from us is mercy, not sacrifice. So it's all the other things that we do in his name, otherwise our sacrifices for him, are not as important as us showing his love through his mercy. So I want you guys to keep that concept of mercy in your back pocket, and we'll come back to it. But in pondering this, I came to realize that if Jesus is saying that these are the two most important things in life, there has to be both something very simple about it, because a child should be able to understand it, but it also should be deeply profound as well. That it's got to be more than just platitudes and pleasantries, more than just placards on the wall saying the golden rule and treat others like you want to be treated. There has to be deeply foundational with what we do. So I'm not going to take the time to go through all the verses that support this, but I encourage you guys to do that and allow the Spirit to convict you of the topic. But what I'm going to do today instead is delve into two different biblical stories about loving your neighbor as yourself, just to kind of see what the Bible's teaching us about this commandment. But first, it's really important to recognize that before we can love our neighbor, we need to love God. That has to come first. That's what gives us the ability to love our neighbor. So when we accept that he loves us, when we internalize that love and forgiveness, it allows us to better love those around us. We really cannot manufacture this type of love on our own. It has to come from God. And I think where we've gone astray in society is we have just forgotten who our neighbor is. And we've lost sight on what it means to love somebody as yourself. So we're going to look at two sides of the spectrum for who is our neighbor, from best friend to enemy, so we can decide who then is worthy of us showing Jesus' love. Okay, so I think it's really easy to identify your friends as being your neighbors, so we're going to start there. So I want you to think about your very best friend. Get that picture in your mind. Think about when and how you met, how old you were, what's your relationship like, what's your background like, how often do you see each other. For me personally, there are two women in my life who I can call my very best friends. One of them I met in 3rd grade. She's actually here today, so everyone can welcome Christy and Odin after the service today. The other one I met on the very first day of graduate school. And in both cases, we became instant best friends. And that's actually really remarkable for me. You might not know this about me, but I am a natural introvert through and through. It takes me a very long time, I feel like, to make good friends because I crave deep and authentic relationships, and I don't really thrive on small talk. But both of these friendships were solid right from the beginning, and so I've always been so grateful for them. I don't live near either of these friends. Christy lives in Bellingham. My other friend lives in Ohio. but distance never dampers that friendship. One of them I speak to less often, the other one I speak to almost every day. And both friendships are defined by authenticity, loyalty, and this bond that's based on our true selves. I care about these women. I care about what happens to them, what's important to them, about their families, their kids. I'm happy when they're happy. I feel pain when they're hurting. I would like to say that I love them as myself, but I know that there's always room for growth, even in the very best relationships. So keep, your best friend in your mind as we go through this biblical example of best friends. So I'm going to have you guys turn with me to 1 Samuel 18. We're going to be kind of parked in there for a little while. So I've recently been going through the Old Testament, kind of revisiting the stories of the kings, because I haven't read through them in a while. And that's what launched this sermon, was reading through the life of David. But I'm not actually interested in David today. What I'm interested in is his best friend, Jonathan, and their relationship. So giving some backstory to where we are in 1 Samuel 18. So Saul is still king, but Samuel has already established David as the successor. David has just stepped up and killed Goliath. He cuts off his head. Sometimes we forget that part of the story. We think it's all just nice and easy, this little slingshot, but he does cut off Goliath's head, and he carries Goliath's head to Saul. So he's now in Saul's presence, and he presents the head saying, hey, we've won. So now he has established himself as a warrior. And that's where we pick up the story here. So in 1 Samuel 18:1, we read, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David and loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. So when I read this story, I was immediately struck by the description of this relationship, that Jonathan loved David as himself. And the fact that this phrase is used twice in just this passage. So it just made me stop and wonder, that's interesting. I wonder if the Bible describes other relationships like this, of expressly laying out that someone loves someone else as themselves. And the parable of the Good Samaritan is related, and we will get to that. But it turns out the answer is really no. We have the example of Jesus doing this, but it doesn't actually say anywhere else that person X loved person Y as themselves. So to say then that 3 times, because he uses it again in just a couple chapters later, that Jonathan loved David as himself, it should be a cue for us to pause and take note of what's special about this relationship. What is God trying to teach us here? So first, let's take a step back and set the scene for loving your neighbor. So in Old Testament times, the Jews would have been really familiar with this phrase because it was part of Levitical law. So as Wyatt said in Leviticus 19:18, God commands, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And this is the first use of this phrase in the Bible. So when the readers of 1 Samuel would have heard that Jonathan loved David as himself, their minds would have gone to this portion of the law. And then to read it 3 times would have been this red flag saying, everybody take note. So what can we learn from this relationship? So going back to the story, from this first passage, we learned that Jonathan freely gave what was his to his friend. He offered David his robe, his tunic, his bow, and his belt. So it's important to remember that these were warrior times. So all of these items were essential for a soldier. They were essential for Jonathan to succeed in battle, but also to protect himself. So ultimately what he was doing was sharing with David what was most important to him, which was an incredibly selfless act. And so you'll see that selflessness is a theme in loving your neighbor as yourself, somewhat ironically. So moving on in the story, things start to get a little rocky between Saul and Jonathan, between Saul and David, because Saul's really jealous, which then gives us the opportunity to see, how Jonathan reacts. So in chapter 19, we see that Saul sets out to kill David, and he gives the kill order not to just all of his attendants, but also directly to Jonathan. So starting in verse 1 of chapter 19, we read, Saul now urged his servants and his son Jonathan to assassinate David. But Jonathan, because of his strong affection for David, told him what his father was planning. "Tomorrow morning," he warned him, "you must find a hiding place out in the fields. I'll ask my father to go out there with me, and I'll talk to him about you. Then I'll tell you everything I can find out." So the next morning, Jonathan spoke with his father about David, saying many good things about him. "The king must not sin against his servant David," Jonathan said. "He's never done anything to harm you. He always helped you in any way he could. Have you forgotten the time he risked his life to kill the Philistine giant and how the Lord brought a great victory to all Israel as a result? You were certainly happy about it then. Why should you murder an innocent man like David? There is no reason for it all." So Saul listened to Jonathan and vowed, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed." Afterwards, Jonathan called David and told him what had happened. Then he brought David to Saul, and David served in the court as before. So in this case, how is Jonathan loving his neighbor as himself? So primarily, he was more concerned about the welfare of his friend than he was about following through with his father's and then the king's direct order. And not only did he not follow through on the order, he directly confronted Saul in order to advocate for David. So it's easy to kind of skim over this, but this was a really big deal. This was really bold for Jonathan to defy Saul directly this way. It was a risk for Jonathan, very risky. So it was another very selfless act done to benefit David. So the story continues, and we know, of course, Saul doesn't really stay appeased for very long. And again, he wants to kill David. But Jonathan is like, "Well, I don't know, because he said that he wasn't going to. I don't know if you're right this time, David." So the friends come up with a test to see what Saul's reaction would be if David were going to be absent from a really important feast. And they finish formulating their plan by making an oath to each other. So moving to chapter 20, verse 16, we read that, "So Jonathan made a solemn pact with David, saying, 'May the Lord destroy all your enemies.' And Jonathan made David reaffirm his vow of friendship again, for Jonathan loved David as he loved himself." So here's our phrase again. Another reminder of Jonathan's true love for David. So ultimately what Jonathan is doing here is he's pledging his support for David no matter the cost, even if it means for the Lord to destroy his enemy, which was Jonathan's own father. So what happens then? The day of the feast comes, David's absent as planned, and Saul is livid. He is so angry, and he directs his anger directly at Jonathan. So skipping to verse 30, we read that Saul boiled with rage at Jonathan. "You stupid son of a whore," he swore at him. You don't think that I know that you want him to be king in your place, shaming yourself and your mother? As long as that son of Jesse is alive, you will never be king. Now go out and get him so I can kill him." "But why should he be put to death?" Jonathan asked his father. "What has he done?" Then Saul hurled his spear at Jonathan, intending to kill him. So at last, Jonathan realized that his father was really determined to kill David. Jonathan left the table in fierce anger and refused to eat on the second day of the festival, for he was crushed by his father's shameful behavior of David. So this is where we come to the real crux of what made Jonathan's friendship with David so remarkable. Again, it was costly for Jonathan to be friends with David. This wasn't a friendship of convenience or proximity. So have you guys had friends like that before, where you're really only friends because you share similar spaces? Sometimes your neighbors are like that, or your coworkers, or your classmates. The distance, the proximity goes away, and the friendship just kind of fizzles out. But this was not the case for Jonathan. So their friendship went beyond all tribal ties, went beyond family loyalties, and went beyond cultural norms. He was putting his life in danger to protect David, and he was risking Saul's direct wrath. And it's interesting, that Jonathan was more grieved by the fact of how his father was treating David than he was by the fact that his father just threw a spear at him trying to kill him. But he was more upset about his friend. But most importantly here, Jonathan knew that by being friends with David, he was giving up his own claim to the throne because he was heir. It's kind of like if we can look at David and Jonathan as a Christ-like figure and then the church. It's like us giving up our own claim to the throne in order to support Jesus and his claiming of being the king. So Jonathan's desire to love David as himself was utterly selfless in this. So perhaps maybe that's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. Again, not just to treat them like you want to be treated, but to view others as an actual extension of who you are. And in that way, being selfless feels okay because your desires are being fulfilled in that other person. So to sum up this friendship here, this biblical example of what it means to love your best friend as yourself, we learn again that loving your neighbor is more than just treating someone like you want to be treated. This type of love is radical, it's wholehearted, and it's sacrificial. It puts the other's needs in front of your own. And it doesn't sacrifice for its own sake, but it sacrifices for the sake of love and mercy. Jonathan's love for David did not set him up for any personal gain. It was setting him up for extreme loss, but he continued to love him anyway. And I think that this is the kind of foundational love that Jesus is calling us to when he tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves. So I'm sure we can all identify with loving your friends or loving your families. But, as Christians living in this polarized society, I think a lot of us have forgotten who our neighbors are. And the truth is, we don't live in a world of best friends, right? Do you guys agree with that? We don't live in a world of best friends. So that brings us to a story of mercy and the expansion then of who we consider our neighbor. So we're going to look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. So if you're here last week, Pastor Eugene did a great job talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan, so I apologize for the redundancy, but I hope maybe we can learn a little bit more from it today. So the parable of the Good Samaritan is the only other place where an example of loving your neighbor is expressly laid out in those words. So in Luke 10, the teacher of the law comes to Jesus, asks him what the most important commandments are. He answers, as we've already said, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And in verse 29, it keeps going. He says that the man wanted to justify his actions. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And Jesus replied with a story. That's what I love about Jesus. He always replies with stories. It says, a Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If this bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus asked, and the man replied, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. So friends, let's remember that Jesus is desiring mercy, not sacrifice. And it's the mercy that drives us to be selfless and then to make the sacrifices. So here we have a neighbor who is not a best friend, but in that time would be considered an enemy. And I like how in the NLT it describes him as a despised Samaritan. So this Samaritan, despite his background, his identity, the cultural conflicts between Jews and Samaritans, he had compassion on the man who was thoroughly beat up. The Samaritan, he personally tended to his needs. He didn't just throw him 2 coins, say, go on, take care of yourself, so that he could relieve himself of guilt, but he personally bandaged his wounds. We also need to remember that you didn't touch people who were bleeding in that time. That was a big deal for him to set himself aside and to care for these man's wounds personally. He gave up his own donkey so that the man could ride it to the inn, which meant he had to walk. He stayed with the man in the inn to take care of him before passing him directly to the innkeeper. And those 2 coins that he gave the innkeeper, the commentary says they were worth about 2 days of wages. So this was a substantial cost for this Samaritan. It was costly of his time. It was costly of his personal boundaries and space, and it was certainly costly of his money. He had nothing to gain by being a neighbor to the certain man that was beat up. So like Jonathan, he was acting selfless because of his compassion and his mercy. So from these two stories, we learn that the principles of loving your neighbor as yourself are the same, whether your neighbor is your best friend or your enemy. So my question to you then is that how are you doing in loving others as yourself? So let's start with our closest relationships. So are we exhibiting this kind of love with our families and our spouses and our children? Are they seeing Jesus in our lives? If you go out a little bit further from your center of influence, maybe to people who aren't quite as close to you, maybe they don't quite believe like you, maybe you're not personally invested in them, how are you doing in loving them? What about your actual neighbors? Like, do your people who live next door to you, do they see Jesus in your lives? What about, your coworkers or our church family? How are we doing in loving each other here? And you go further from the center of your lives. What about your acquaintances or that person you meet at the coffee shop or the grocery store? Do your interactions with them display the love of Jesus? But most challenging, how are we doing in loving the people who don't think, act, or believe like we do? So if you look around this world, I just see this epidemic of unlovingness. So log on to social media. I challenge you, not right now, later. Give yourself a timer of 3 minutes and see if you can go 3 minutes without reading a post of somebody posting at the expense of somebody else. You turn on the regular news, and of course we see examples of people acting unlovingly right now. Our climate has just become so emotionally charged and toxic, where it just created this environment where everybody's become defined by their beliefs in different things, different issues. If it's right, if it's left, if it's mask, no mask, war, no war, whatever it is. Million other issues where we live in this us against them type culture. But the problem is who we consider us and who we consider them is constantly changing and shifting. But the problem with this kind of polarization is that it kills compassion. So I've actually done quite a bit of looking into the research on compassion. There's actually a lot of research on empathy and compassion and ways that it can be built. There's a great book called The War for Kindness that talks a lot about this. But in it explains some of the research that shows that when we assign people to an out-group rather than our in-group, our levels of compassion and empathy for that person decline. And I think this is why it's such a powerful tool of Satan. When we spend so much time demonizing the people around us, we lose sight of the actual demons that are trying to pull us away from Jesus and from loving each other. And what I find heartbreaking is when I see Christians acting in this polarized manner, speaking words of hate toward other full groups or toward anyone, but doing it in the name of Jesus. So I'm going to be really frank with you. Any unloving action done in the name of Jesus is a misuse of his name. Can I say that again? Any unloving action done in the name of Jesus is a misuse of his name. Rather than any kind of radicalization, Jesus wants us to focus on radical love instead. Those are the things that he is saying, why do you listen to me and don't do what I say? So what we need to do then is expand who we view our neighbor is, because ultimately it's everybody. So the converse to the in-group, out-group research is true. When we expand who we view as our in-group, it allows our empathy to grow. It gives it space to grow. So I can give you an example. So if you consider yourself, a member of the Academy Church, that is our in-group, we automatically have a little bit of empathy and compassion toward the people in this in-group. But now let's expand that. Let's say that we're members of kind of the greater Adventist church in the Puget Sound. Now everybody at City, everyone at Enumclaw, everyone at Kent and Bonnie Lake, they're all now part of our group, and our empathy for them also increases. We can go further on the conference level. So everybody in Washington that's an Adventist is now part of our group. You can go out to the NAD, then you can go to the World Church. But friends, we can't stop at the world church. So remember, the foundation that matters of being a Christian is the belief in Jesus Christ. There are other Christians. We need to go out then to other Christians. They might have different toppings on their haystack, but we've got the same foundation, friends. We are all believers in Jesus Christ. They are all our neighbors there. But then we can't stop there too. From there, you go just as simply a child of God. And so in this case, our empathy grows toward every other child of God in the world. You could do the same thing politically. Rather than right or left, you're American. Rather than American, you're a world citizen. And now you have the opportunity to care for every other person, which means everybody is our neighbor and everybody is worthy of our love and our mercy, right? This is pretty much what Jesus was saying on the Sermon on the Mount when he says, "You have heard the law that it says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you'll be acting as true children of your Father in heaven. For he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. If you love only those who love you, what reward is there for that? Even corrupt tax collectors do that much. If you're kind only to your friends, how are you different than anybody else? Even pagans do that. You are to be perfect, though, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." Again, these are those challenging words that Jesus wants us to listen to and then follow through with to change our lives. And our lives should be different than people who don't believe in Jesus, right? So I challenge you then, just like I challenge myself to do here, is expand our in-group to view everybody as a child of God. So the next time you find yourself angry at an entire group of people, the next time you find yourself tempted to share or to pass along that disparaging post that someone made against somebody else or against an entire group of people, the next time you find yourself tempted to hurl insults, or you witness somebody beat up on the side of the road, either figuratively, because we are really good at beating people up figuratively, or literally, because that's happening too. People are literally getting beat up. We need to choose the road of mercy instead. So remember then to be a neighbor. So coming to the end here, all this reminds me of kindergarten, because I told you this was also about kindergarten, right? So, most of us are taught from the very beginning what basic decency looks like. But as we get more sophisticated, I think sometimes we forget it. So there was this really popular book published in the mid-'80s that we had on our bookshelf growing up. It was called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. It's by author Robert Fulghum. And I found myself thinking about this book often during the pandemic, in particular the first time I went to a Starbucks and I had to stand on the little circle. It's like, here, stand in a little circle, 6 feet apart, don't touch, personal space. It's like, oh, this feels like kindergarten here. Wash your hands, everybody. So it made me think a lot about this book. So it's a book of poems, or kind of just observations of life. And so the title poem is called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. And the author shares his credo for his life. So I'm going to share that with you. What he says is, all I really need to know about how to live and what to do and how to be, I learned in kindergarten. Wisdom was not found at the top of the graduate school mountain, but there in the sandpile at school. These are the things I learned. Share everything. Play fair. Don't hit people. Put things back where you found them. Clean up your own mess. Don't take things that aren't yours. Say you're sorry when you've hurt somebody. Warm cookies and cold milk are good for you. Live a balanced life. Learn some, think some, draw and paint and sing and dance and play and work every day some. Take a nap every afternoon. When you go out into the world, watch out for traffic, hold hands, and stick together. Be aware of wonder. Remember the little seed in the styrofoam cup? The roots go down, the plant goes up, and nobody really knows how or why, but we're all like that. Goldfish and hamsters and white mice and even the little seed in the styrofoam cup, they all die. So do we. And then remember the Dick and Jane books and the first word you learned, the biggest word of all, look. Everything you need to know is in there somewhere. The golden rule and love and basic sanitation, ecology and politics and equality and sane living. Take any one of those items and extrapolate it into sophisticated adult terms and apply it to your family life or your work or your government or the world, and it holds true and clear and firm. Think what a better world it would be if we all, the whole world, had cookies and milk about 3 o'clock every afternoon and then laid down with our blankies for a nap. Right. And if all governments had as basic policy to always put things back where they found them and to clean up their own messes. And it's still true, no matter how old you are, when you go out into the world, it's best to hold hands and stick together. Right? So these are the basic principles of treating each other well that we need to get back to. But I think the biggest aspect of doing this as a Christian is recognizing that our decency doesn't come from us. We cannot self-generate this type of radical love, especially to those people we don't like. It's kind of love, it has to come from God. And this is where the fruits of the Spirit comes in. So I was talking this over with Rome, and he was saying, hey, actually, you know what's really interesting is that the Greek word for fruit used in this passage is karpos. But karpos is a singular word, meaning that there's really only one fruit of the Spirit, which is love. All of the others, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control, those are all ways in which we can live out that love. So to be one in spirit with someone else, like Jonathan was one in spirit with David, we first have to be one in spirit with God. And that's just the amazing thing about the God we serve. He's going to do the hard work in changing our hearts toward our neighbors. Again, it's not our job to self-generate that love. We just have to offer ourselves to him and allow him to do the cleansing. So the more time that we spend with him, the more time we spend learning his teachings, following through with them, earnestly praying and seeking him, the more we're going to feel his love for us. And the more then we're going to realize that we all have imperfections as well, and that he's forgiven us through that, through his mercy. Then we can then go and forgive others, and the more we're going to be able to pour out then our love on everybody we meet, whether or not they're our best friends. So I've been thinking of a new definition of church in this, especially as our church is trying to rebuild itself. I believe that church is a group of imperfect people together clinging to the grace and the mercy of a perfect God, right? Church is a group of imperfect people together clinging to the grace and the mercy of a perfect God. So in closing here, I challenge you to return to the foundations of who we are as Christians. Let's embrace the basics and not get caught up in all the details. Maybe remember that we are ambassadors of Jesus, and the world is only going to know that we are disciples by the extent in which we are loving the people around us. So my prayer today is that we can all recommit to Jesus to follow his simple yet profound teachings of this radical and selfless love.